In fact, the term Thinking Schools Learning Nation was coined around about 1997. You would see from the different phases of education that I'll be tracing for you this morning about the different educational initiatives and the overload, I'd say, of acronyms that come with each and every initiative. So, where are we? For a long time, people thought that we were part of China because China is a very, very big player within Asia. And in Singapore, we have about 78% of Chinese people. So I am a third generation Chinese from the south of China. My grandparents would be originally from China, right? But we are not part of China. We are a small country, 3 degrees north of the equator. So I'm used to temperatures of, the weather in Singapore is hot and hotter. There's only 2 types of environments or weather conditions, and typically it would be about 90 degrees Fahrenheit or about 30 degrees Celsius, around about there, every single day with a very, very high humidity. Very good for the skin, by the way. So, yeah. Okay, human resource is seen as our country's most important asset because we truly do not have natural resources. I shared with the group, and in this context I'll be more politically correct. We do not produce all of our nation's water supply, so we do buy water, for example, from our neighbor, that is Malaysia. But within Singapore, we also have huge recycling plants to recycle our water in such a way that it becomes safe to drink again. In terms of land area, we are only about the size of Greater London, 612 square kilometers, work that out into miles. And education is seen, therefore, as a key enabler for our people to move on in the 21st century. Oops. I've been speaking about the Singapore education system to different international audiences. A lot of people would like to know, what is your GDP, proportion of spending on education? Well, it's 11.6 billion, and that would be US dollars, because I've done the conversion for convenience, and that was last year. And in fact, I had the figures for 2012, and that was 10.6 billion. We have about 33,000 education officers for a population of about 5 million. And we have over, now I think more accurately, 360 schools in Singapore. It's a small context, so I wanted you to understand the kind of scale that we're talking about. And it has been, as Scott has mentioned, an education system for a small nation that has stood up for many reasons. But I guess the most important reason being that ever since the proliferation, as it were, of internationally benchmarked tests of student performance like PEARLS, TIMSS, and PISA. I think these are acronyms I can safely use without having to decode them. Singapore's been emerging the top 5. So we've suddenly come into prominence and people want to know, how did you do it? This would be from the Ministry of Education website, and they very quickly came up with a one-sheet fact sheet, if you like, after our 2012 PISA results were revealed. And there are some interesting demographics that I would like to point out, or data that I'd like to point out very quickly over here. First column, the thing to note would be that in terms of math literacy, Singapore is second. I'm sorry that there's some blue against light blue against dark blue. So for math literacy skills, we're second. For reading literacy, we're about third. And for science literacy, we are also about third. And what I need to point out is that the other nations within Asia that are top, for example, Shanghai, Hong Kong, etc., have taken the test in their home language. But we have taken the test in the English language, using the English medium. So this is something that's significant. The second column, something that we're very proud about, would be the fact that we have been very conscious about trying to level up the low progress learners. And you would see in the second column how we have, in the orange area, lessened the amount of people or percentage of students in the lower bands. So you can see the decrease, for example, for low performance in mathematics, going down by 1 to 2%, and in reading it's about a couple of percent. And what you see in light blue would be the OECD average of low progress learners across different fields of study. And in the third column, Singapore continues to rise in the percentage of high performers in mathematics, reading, and science. So that's quick data for you. So the question that a lot of people would ask Singaporeans would be, how did you do it? We are a very young nation. We achieved independence in 1965. We were a British colony, founded by the British in 1819. We eventually got full independence from the British. I think it was 1959, but we at first were merged with Malaysia, and then we achieved total independence in 1965. So we are very young, less than 50 years old. And this would be our education milestones. You notice that I also started in 1959 for obvious reasons. There are different phases of education, and in each phase, there is a philosophy that guides the educational reforms implementation. In the early phase, it was really, as the name suggests, a survival-driven phase for education. And this would span from 1959 all the way till 1978. I will go through each of these phases in a little bit more detail in a little while. Efficiency-driven phase would be from 1979 to 1986, moving on to ability-driven education, and that would be where Thinking Schools, Learning Nation would come in. It was launched in 1997 in the World's International Thinking Conference that was held in Singapore. And since 2012, 2 years ago to the present, we like to think of ourselves as being in the values-driven, student-centric phase of education. So moving forward, survival-driven phase. In yellow, you would see the underpinning philosophy, or orange, as the case may be. This would characterize the massification of education and teacher training. There was a need to provide education opportunities for all children and going right to the basics of raising enrollment rates for students into schools. So there was the establishment of a strong central control to support the setting up of standardized school curricula in a very diverse educational landscape. So this was just immediately post-independence. The efficiency-driven phase would characterize Singapore from 1979 to 1996. And here, the key philosophy would again be in orange, putting in place an education system and teacher training program that maximizes efficiency and reduces performance variation across the school system. So, for example, we introduce differentiated learning streams. So, for example, in 1980, we introduced streaming at a very young age of grade 3. All right. Grade 3, 9 years of age, typically. And this would include a monolingual stream and a bilingual stream. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a while. So the performers who could go on to the bilingual stream would be those who have done fairly well, and there'll be a proportion who would be identified at that stage to only study English rather than English and a second language. And we introduced streaming, and the focus was really to raise the quality of teaching and reduce high dropout rates, and putting in place an education system with great efficiency, hence the term efficiency-driven phase. Moving forward, 1997, all the way up to 2012, is known as the ability-driven phase of education. And in this phase, if you like, this was our then premier, Goh Chok Tong, and he coined the term Thinking Schools, Learning Nation, known as TSLN for short in Singapore. And it focused at creating an ability-driven education where each child is helped to realize or maximize his or her potential. So you can see some of the key education initiatives in coral red over here. For example, there's the formulation of the desired outcomes of education, the infusion of the Information and Communication Technologies Master Plan. Some of these, if they do account somewhat for our educational success, I will be talking about them in a while. And then we move on to the values-driven, student-centric phase. First person to mention that is our current Minister for Education. In 2012, he talked about a values-driven, student-centric education, and it really was about recognizing the diverse abilities, talents to grow and nurture them. There was also the conceptualization of what we now call the Swiss roll model, because it looks like a Swiss roll. And this is actually known as the 21st century competencies or desired outcomes of education. Again, I will be talking about it in greater depth when I talk about the education system as a whole. So that's just a very broad overview. So people ask us, how did we achieve so much in so few years, which is less than 50 years? The first thing I'd like to talk about is a strong culture of respect for learning and hard work. I think it is very much a part of Asian tradition and culture. To do academically well is considered making your parents especially proud of you. So it is something that every child would like to. I think we are all hardwired to do well in tests, for example. I made a joke that, if I studied very well for a test, I sort of like to think of it as my wedding day, and I wear all my new clothes, etc. for test. That's how positive our attitude towards test taking was. That's if you're very prepared. If you're not, then you wish the bus would roll over you. I'm just kidding. Well, in terms of the general philosophy would be a meritocratic society. This means that in spite of whatever socio-economic status you might come from, you have equal opportunities for education, and there's a very quick way of doing it. The government is very generous about giving scholarships for bright scholars. At 18, you would be handpicked if you have done well to already start pursuing your undergraduate study, or for some, postgraduate studies. And it does come with a price, because we are not, at that phase we do, or rather even now, we need to ensure that we do not suffer from a brain drain. So the little clause would be, I pay for your education, that's the government, but you need to come back and serve a bond. If you do break your bond, you just need to pay back the amount plus compounded interest. Okay, so this is how it's taken very, very seriously, and we'll talk a little bit more about this maybe in the Q&A section if we are interested. So it is a culture that is a philosophy of education founded on meritocracy. And in terms of the curriculum, there is much rigor and standards of curriculum and good pedagogies. Curriculum content is centralized, and philosophies and the outcomes for each particular subject is centralized at the Ministry of Education, although textbook writing has now been devolved to private companies, but they must be accredited by the Ministry of Education. But there are quite a lot of providers now. Centralized curriculum and content, and teaching strategies are constantly being updated so that they can truly help to engage students in today's 21st century world. And assessment, obviously, is something that is very important. There's a saying that assessment's the tail that wags the dog, sorry. Anyway, it's very, very important that assessment is moving away from formative assessment to more summative assessment, and assessment in terms of the philosophy of learning should be assessment as learning, not assessment of learning. This is also a unique feature of our system, where English is our main medium of instruction in schools, and all students also learn their ethnic mother tongue. So in terms of the main racial groups in Singapore, we have Chinese, majority, about 78%. Then we move on to Malays and Indians and others. Others would be Eurasians, for example, cross marriages between Europeans and Asians. So in terms of the main ethnic mother tongue, therefore, a student would be given the option to take Mandarin Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. But your first language, or if you like, the language of instruction in schools is English. For this reason, we have a very special type of bilingual program known as English knowing bilingualism. This is deliberate because we are a multi-ethnic, multi-racial country, and we therefore need a language that is ethnically neutral, which is why English has been selected. And also, English allows us to access all the materials written in English in the world. I had to write a book recently, and I surveyed that over 60% of websites in the world are written in English. So this would be, of course, English is an international language, and it gives you currency and relevance. Now, we also have a very strong emphasis on mathematics and science, and in fact, many countries from around the world like to ask us how we do this. So we believe in providing our students with strong fundamentals in both mathematics and science. And I talked about this. This was first introduced in 1997. It's known as the Information Communication Technology Master Plan. And there were 3 phases. The first phase, or what they call the IT Master Plan 1, 2, and 3. So the Information Technology Master Plan 1 was truly about providing schools with the basic infrastructure in order to harness the power of technology in their classrooms. The second phase, IT Master Plan 2, was truly about allowing a more pervasive use of information communication technology for the purposes of education. When it comes to IT Master Plan 3, we want to harness information technology effectively for customization of students' learning so that they can be helped to achieve. And we have, in fact, future schools. The vision is that by 2016, we have 15 future schools. What it truly means would be that these schools have been identified to lead the way in terms of the use of information communication technology to move ahead in terms of student engagement, student teaching, and learning. So that's our vision, 2015 rather, 15 future schools in 2015. And I mentioned that there's also now a very strong focus on holistic education. So it would surprise a lot of people, but I need to mention this here, that if you were to surf the Ministry of Education website, for example, you would find that if you typed in desired outcomes of education, you would never find academic achievement or test scores as the first goal or even mentioned at all. Instead, it is about educating the whole child aesthetically, physically, intellectually, socially, morally, spiritually. And this is right on the landing page of the Ministry of Education website. We are very concerned that our students do emerge with the right set of values to function in a 21st century global workplace and society. And we try to do this outside of the formal curricula through many exposures, which I can talk about if you're interested in. So in pre-service teacher education, for example, we have a compulsory and mandatory service learning project or community involvement project, which every student teacher passing through our portals has to complete before being allowed to graduate. So we take this very seriously. So moving into the 21st century, here are some challenges that the world faces. And a lot of people have called it a world where it's very volatile, changing. Many things are unpredictable in this 21st century. I'd now like to talk a little bit about the Swiss role model that I first showed you under the values-driven, student-centric phase of education. At the outside of the circle, you have 4 desired outcomes that we would like to see of 21st century learners emerging from our education system. And they are a confident person, a self-directed learner who is able to take on lifelong learning at their own pace, at their own time, at their own target, an active contributor both to the local and global society, as well as a concerned citizen. We want someone who is concerned and not apathetic about what's happening in the world around them. And what you have on the outermost orange circle would be what we have conceptualized broadly to be 21st century skills. Information communication skills are key in this century, critical and inventive thinking, as well as civic literacy, global awareness, and cross-cultural skills in this increasingly globalized, knowledge-based world. And right in the center, we have core values. And in the pink outer circle, if you like, these are what we call socio-emotional competencies, or what we call SEL, social emotional learning competencies that we want our students to have. For example, self-awareness is very important, self-management, and so on and so forth. So that defines what we call 21CC for short, standing for 21st century competencies that guides the delivery, design of our educational philosophy. I left this for last because this is the area that I would be focusing most on. So a lot of people have asked us, what is the true secret of success? And it is I think it's an open secret to many of us who are fellow educators here. It is really about good quality teachers and teaching, and school leaders, the development of school leaders. So how does Singapore ensure and sustain a high quality teaching force? I'll be sharing with you right from recruitment and selection to pre-service teacher preparation to teacher professional development and teacher career development as well. So we do recruit teachers from the top 30% of each cohort. That's the minimum benchmark. It's very easy how we arrived at this figure because only the top 30% make it to higher ed in Singapore. And from this figure, frankly, the people that get into teaching are more like the top 10 to 15% for the simple reason that there's a very, very rigorous selection interview that is normally chaired by a principal, a serving principal or vice principal, or a recently retired principal or vice principal. And what happens is that the success rate is very low. 1 in 8 are successful because we screen them not just based on the baseline results, which by the time they come for the interview they would have met, but we are screening for aptitude, for teaching, attitude, and personality. And what we do look out for would be if it's a very soft-spoken person who doesn't speak up at the interview and tells you that they love teaching. We would very frankly, we have a different grading band, so we might say that the person is then not suitable for teaching at that point in time. So there's a grading band which determines whether that person can come back for the interview, say after a couple of years in another profession, for example. Okay, so we take it very seriously, and I have sat on these panels as the university faculty representative, but I can tell you that the people who truly have the say would be the school leaders, because they would look at someone and say, you don't want that person anywhere near your school, and they have 30 or 40 years of experience that you truly cannot argue with. We source for talent very early, and we have interesting teacher internship schemes where young 17, 18-year-olds are exposed to schools for teaching. They don't necessarily teach, but they, for example, can go for an overseas teaching exposure attached to schools, following somebody else. Obviously, they don't teach, but we source for talent very early. And we also offer teaching scholarships to the top 300 students who apply for teaching. And this is tenable both locally as well as abroad. Typically abroad, we do send them to, if it's in the US, would be the Ivy League universities. If it's to the UK, it would be to Oxbridge. So we believe in sourcing out talent very early, recruiting the best and the brightest into the profession. Now this, in a nutshell, published by McKinsey & Co., is what happens during our recruitment and selection process. So the minimum level would obviously be that you need to meet the minimum university benchmark for entry into higher education before we then screen you for relevant school experience, if any, because some people may not come into teaching as their first career. There must be assessment tests, mainly of literacy, mainly of proficiency, I would say, in English. We take, at the end of 12 years of study, the Cambridge General Certificate of Education Ordinary Level Examination, or GCE O-Level examinations. And our benchmark would be, if you have B3 or a distinction, A1, A2, you do not need to take an additional entrance English proficiency test. But if it's anything below that, even if you have passed, you need to pass a locally set internationally benchmarked test. These days, we do allow the IELTS in place of the entrance proficiency test, but the IELTS is expensive because it's run by an international body. So we try to encourage them to take our local version of the test that is benchmarked against the IELTS. In terms of interview, I think I've mentioned what happens. But we also closely monitor our students. Before I assumed the current position as Head Academic Quality Management, I spent 9 years in teacher education. My first 5 years was as a sub-dean for degree. I was in charge of all the undergraduate students on campus. From the minute they applied, I had to attract them to apply, so I would give a lot of outreach talks. To the minute they stepped in, I would run the orientation program. But the part that I truly enjoyed was what I would call academic counseling. So anybody who has failed a module or who has not turned up for class or not submitted an assignment, I would have to see them personally. And this is where we would begin to screen to see if in the course of their 4-year journey, are there any hiccups that are happening in their academic life, which is very normally tied to what's happening at home, could be financial problems or other more serious problems. But I would stop the minute I assess that the person really is suffering from some kind of psychological problems, and then we have a professional counselor, or even in serious cases, a psychologist that would be consulted. So I enjoyed that part of my work very much, and this is one of the gateways that we use. The other gateway is at our clinical experience. which I don't really have time to talk about, but in a 4-year program, we send our students out in incremental periods totaling about 22 weeks or 17% of our program. And that tends to truly separate the, the sheep from the goats, as it were. So if there are people who truly cannot cope, we would signal to the Ministry of Education that, hang on, maybe this person is not ready for schools. So in terms of teaching and its prestige and how it is viewed in Singapore, the government has been very strong in the signaling that teachers play an integral role in nation building. And I got this out of the website, the cover of a Ministry of Education Stats Digest report 2012 has this tagline, molding the future of our nation. So from a very early beginning, teachers realized their important role in nation building. So the other thing is we also have a very competitive compensation package. Pre-service education is paid for. Tuition fees are paid for, in other words, it's free, on top of which they are paid in the 4-year program. In the first 2 years, you are paid a salary. In the next 2 years, if you have done well, you are given an annual stipend. In return for all that, before you even step in, you have to sign a bond with the Ministry of Education. And what happens is, at the point of graduation, so this is 4 years of study, you frankly owe the government a mountain of debt if you decide to quit the profession. And then as you serve, the loan amount draws down. So there are some people, because of family circumstances, for example, they have to emigrate abroad and they have to break their bond, then it is quite critical when they decide to break the bond, because the bond amount would diminish as time goes by, right? And there are competitive salaries, as I've mentioned, since I've put this set of slides together. Key education stakeholders who have seen some of these slides now think that it is perhaps more accurate for me to say that the beginning salaries are pegged to that of beginning accountants and lawyers. Sorry, accountants and engineers rather than doctors and lawyers, right? So it's beginning accountants and engineers. And what I would also like to say is that for mid-career entrants, and we do have some top lawyers, bankers, who suddenly decide that their calling is to be a teacher, what we do in Singapore is that we do take into account their past working experience. So when they emerge from pre-service teacher education, they would not start at a beginning teacher's pay. Their previous work experience and previously drawn pay would be taken into consideration. So that's how we can attract a second wave of teachers into the system, typically in their late 30s or early 40s. So they have a good runway of about another 20, 25 years more into the service. Once we have selected them, we put them through a very rigorous pre-service teacher education program that is very carefully thought through. When the Ministry of Education articulated their 21st century competencies, we ourselves were drawing up the teacher education model for the 21st century. And there is a lot of agreement between the two models. And how do we do that? By having constant meetings between professors from the National Institute of Education, typically those who are appointment holders within the Dean's office, for example, as well as representatives from the Ministry of Education. When we review our curriculum, we might even invite Ministry of Education personnel to sit in as committee members. And this is our teacher education model for the 21st century. Right in the center, you have a three-pronged set of values that is mirrored after the corporate colors of my institute, which, by the way, currently still prepares all 33,000 teachers for schools. So anyone who wants to become a teacher has to come through our portals. And there's a three-pronged set of values which takes center stage in our teacher education program. The first value paradigm is that of learner-centeredness. We believe that at the center of our educational endeavors is the learner. The second set of value paradigms would be a strong sense of teacher identity. The reason being that we have scoured the research literature which showed us that teachers who possess a very strong sense of identity and professionalism as a teacher are longer, and they also tend to be able to then contribute to the profession later on. Thirdly, we believe that teaching, unlike any other profession, is in fact a vocation. It is a fraternity where experienced teachers do need to build up via mentorship or stewardship the next generation of teachers for the community. So that forms our third value paradigm. And wrapped around the value paradigms would be what we have searched and scoured the literature to be 21st century skills and knowledge, which we believe our student teachers must possess. Moving forward, I would now like to introduce our graduate teacher competencies. We felt that it was important to signal to the schools and the Ministry of Education where pre-service teacher education has ended and where the schools and the Ministry of Education have to work together to take the beginning teacher up to the next level. Therefore, what we've come up with are 3 performance dimensions, which we did not create. It's part of the enhanced performance management system, which is the annual teacher appraisal system that appraises teachers along these 3 dimensions: professional practice, leadership and management, and personal effectiveness. And what we've done is we've outlined those competencies that we have confidently built in our student teachers, and if we are able to tick off, we call this capacity build, or CB for short. However, in areas that we feel we need to further develop our student teachers, we would then say it's just AR or awareness raising. Partnering parents, for example, would be an area that requires a lot more work. Then, what I've shown you is the values, skills, and knowledge model and the graduate teacher competencies, right? So I had the unenviable task of having to map this into the 388 individual courses run at the Institute for at least a 4-year degree program. So for a while I was very frightened that my car would be scratched by my colleagues, because each and every course chair had to fill in a form that would, as truthfully as possible, declare what they were trying to achieve in the different areas of study across the teacher education program. And you would be asked to tick off. There is obviously, if any researcher is amongst you, this suffers from the paradox of self-perceptions or self-reporting data. But at a glance, it would show you what individual values, skills, knowledge, and if it's values, which one would it be? V1, V2, V3, as well as the individual graduate teacher competencies that we're trying to achieve in the different areas of study. And I had a mathematician on board, the team, and he said that we should only reflect those that have been reported to be covered in the course at least 50% of the time. So that is, if you like, the mind map. And each student teacher is given this mind map so that as they walk into pre-service education, they are able to see the connections between the different areas of study, for example, educational philosophy, compared to their content subjects, compared to curriculum studies, which is teaching methodology courses, and so on and so forth. But interestingly, this is, if you like, the model answer. And when we came up with our teacher education model, I chaired the secretariat, which was responsible for coming up with a 168-page report, which you can download from our website. But my challenge as Associate Dean was to distill this in a way that spoke to the student teachers. So I had many focus group discussions, and I asked the student teachers, how would you like this boring 168-page document to talk to you? And they told me that please make it in a little booklet that we can carry around in the tube, in the subway, on the buses, and it should have loads of pictorials, comic strips. So that's what I had to do. I had to produce a comic strip version of my very serious 168-page policy document. And this is exactly how it looks. And we used, if you look at it, the graphics are quite interesting because I had to work with a graphic artist that we hired to talk about the fact that when you start our teacher education program, you might be like a robot without the heart. But when you emerge, because it's a very value-centric program, you would then emerge as a true teacher with the heart for teaching, and not just a technicist. And the plant analogy is there as well, because teaching is like growing a plant carefully, day by day, and watering it. But what I would like to show you, okay, in the next 2 slides, see, so this is the cover page, and you can see it more clearly. And I like to show this, which is the empty mind map. They had a very complicated model answer, as it were, but each individual student-teacher's journey is different, and you cannot rely on a model answer for that. So we have this in an interactive format, but I've got, of course, have to show you the stills right here, where they need to map their own journeys. The round circles are the main areas of study that I don't really have time to go into, and they need to ask themselves, what have they acquired in terms of values, skills, knowledge, and graduate teacher competencies from these areas of study? And it doesn't stop there. They are given on I think it's Google Sites that we use, they have to have a teaching and learning portfolio where they will truly map their learning journeys. So it's not just about having that nice booklet to teach them what our teacher education model is like, but to be able to internalize it and then tag individual courses, artifacts from courses, into an electronic portfolio. And we call this the Teaching and Learning Portfolio at NIE. It starts with a learning portfolio at pre-service training. It then moves on to the showcasing portfolio, which I'll talk a little bit about during their final clinical practice, or the practicum. And then, as they exit pre-service education, we hope that this will begin to be their teaching portfolio that will accompany them through life as they begin their journeys as professional teachers. Okay, so how does the learning and teaching portfolio look like at their clinical practice? All student teachers are divided into groups under the supervision of the school coordinating mentors, who will hold what we call focused conversations with the student teachers. And the focused conversation at week 1 is to showcase their portfolio that showcases what they've learned at the National Institute of Education. And in weeks 9 and 10, they would then share their portfolio again, but this time it is about their practicum or clinical field experience and what they've learned in school. So when they exit, they have a very proud portfolio, and we even have a portfolio sharing forum for all the student teachers in an LT like this, about their entire learning journey from the theoretical courses to the practical courses, and how that has helped to develop their identities as teachers. In the portfolios, they also need to write their own teaching philosophies that they can revisit at different points in their teaching career. Moving forward, I've talked about recruitment and selection. I've talked also about the rigorous pre-service preparation. We now come to teacher evaluation. I once was asked by the New York Times to talk about the teacher evaluation system. I think I've introduced it briefly just now. It's known as the EPMS for short, or the Enhanced Performance Management System, that aims to achieve 3 goals. A, it is to identify areas of improvement that teachers need to engage in for professional training purposes and development purposes. Secondly, it is also about a very frank discussion of identifying talent for grooming for the teaching profession according to the 3 career tracks that I'll be talking to you about in a while. And finally, it is to uphold the quality of teaching and the integrity of the profession. There are consequences in terms of how you perform and score at your annual appraisal. So, to summarize, it is a tool for self-evaluation, a tool for coaching and mentoring. It is also about performance-based recognition. How well you perform at your appraisal determines the amount of individual performance bonus that you would get every year, if any. And finally, it is also about non-monetary, it helps to determine non-monetary rewards. So as a tool for self-evaluation, we want to look at how they have built themselves in terms of their personal roadmap for development, as well as how they have contributed to the overall goals of the school. As a tool for coaching and mentoring, it begins with a one-on-one target setting with a reporting officer at the beginning of the year, setting of goals, a review of the goals in 6 months, and a final formative assessment right at the end. I'll show you the cycle, again published by McKinsey & Co. in a little while. Look at this. In some ways, I'm very glad that they published it, because now I can cite it as secondary material, because it does contain quite transparent information, if you like. So competencies, let's look at stage one. Competencies are defined and identified, and teachers are then rated using a distribution guideline that is like the ordinary bell curve. So each reporting officer or head of department is responsible for banding and grading each and every one of their staff and rating them. Say if you have 10 people or teachers under your charge, you need to rank them 1 to 10. The reason is because how you rank them then determines how much bonuses they will receive. Now, we grade people from A to E. However, to be in a safe band, you want to be A to C, because we have a joke that D can stand for the door and E stands for exit. So A-rated teachers typically get a bonus of about 3.25 months in addition to their annual salaries. But I have to say that this varies according to the economic health of the country. So bonuses are very much determined according to how well the economy is doing, but this is a typical year. C-graded teachers get an average performance bonus of about 1.5 months. As I mentioned, A, B, C are decent grades. D, typically you get a little bit or no quantum of bonuses if it is in a bad economy. And finally, which is, I guess, where Scott got the messaging, there is a serious consequence. If you get E, E-graded performance are put in a performance review for 6 to 9 months with the possibility of termination. So we're very serious about upholding the profession, and we do it through a very holistic teacher evaluation and appraisal process, which has consequences. But the non-monetary rewards, onto happier things, would be when very high-performing teachers are identified for certain awards at the national level. So for those 30 years and below and have been nominated by their school leaders for the Outstanding Youth in Education Award, or known as OYEA for short. They must be 30 years or under and have displayed some kind of extraordinary teacher leadership. There is also the highest award possible for teachers, which is the President's Award for Teachers. And this, they would receive their award from the President during National Day. So in terms of professional development, we have many systemic enablers, but I'd like to highlight one key point. Every teacher is given 100 hours of paid professional development hours. So it's not just time off, but payment as well, for them to take part in any courses that they desire every single year. So yeah, this is a very unique point of the system, I have to say. Again, I'll run through some of the key points. Of course, the slides will be loaded after this event, so not to worry, but I'll highlight the key points. For the teacher work attachment scheme, I would like to highlight that many teachers can opt to be attached to industries outside of education precisely to broaden their horizons, especially if all they've done in terms of work experience is to teach. So for example, some teachers would choose to be attached to Ritz-Carlton Singapore to learn a little bit about the hotel and catering industry. In 2010, the Academy of Singapore Teachers, which builds on a teacher-led culture of professional excellence, was set up. So they would be generally responsible for professional development of teachers, but I need to say this, that they do not run all the professional development courses, because my institute runs professional development courses for about 15,000 to 18,000 teachers every year. So we work in very close partnership. And in fact, there's quite a bit of differentiation in terms of the type of professional development courses that the Academy runs and the type of courses that we run. So it's all not left to chance, but carefully discussed and agreed upon. So the TEACH framework for professional development stands for teacher professionalism, E stands for engagement, A stands for aspirations, and C stands for career track development, but H is also very important. It's work-life harmony and balance, because we tend to be a little bit of workaholic in Singapore. So that just summarizes what TEACH stands for. I'd like to talk a little bit about this. I was part of the committee that came up with a teacher growth model. This is not a diamond, but a gem. So we believe that every teacher is a gem, and the desired outcomes of teaching or a teaching professional would be an ethical educator, a competent professional, a collaborative learner, a transformational leader, and a community builder. See, it's back to nation building again. But what is interesting about these 5 attributes of professional teachers would be that professional development courses are then grouped under one of these categories. So if you want to build this year your community builder self as a teacher, there'll be a whole slew of courses available online for you to sign up that have more to be linked with values, appreciation of diversity, that sort of thing. I was in the competent professional that would tend to be content upgrading courses or further content development courses. And we call this the teacher growth model for short. We do realize that every teacher is very busy in schools, and there is therefore a need to engage in multiple modes of learning, obviously using the e-platform, not just face-to-face. Now this is what we call the 3 career tracks for teachers. On your extreme left, you have the teaching track. The pinnacle of the teaching track is the principal master teacher. The leadership track, when student teachers start out, they all yearn to be the leadership track. And I tell them that there is only one Director General of Education. So even if you're a principal, there are 360 schools. It doesn't fall naturally that you would emerge to be the one and the only Director General of Education. Thirdly, there's the senior specialist track, the pinnacle of which is the chief specialist. We try to peg each of these comparably in terms of remuneration packages at the pinnacle of their careers, so that no teacher feels that they are being shortchanged. For example, if all they want to do is to teach and to spread good pedagogies and teaching methods amongst a group of teachers. So for the teaching track, you need to achieve teaching excellence in the classroom, and it extends beyond levels. You must think beyond the school level, to the district level, to what we call clusters. And leadership track would be the fact that you'll be groomed to take on different positions in schools. I don't have time to talk about our school leadership development in Singapore. It's really another story and chapter in itself. It's very carefully thought about. And the senior specialist track, typically the ministry would identify areas of expertise that we would need. For example, measurement and evaluation, and send them to top universities abroad to get their master's degree and doctorate in these areas. Retention rates. We have less than 3% attrition annually. Partially that's because of the bond, but even after the bond period, this is a fairly stable rate of attrition every year. Next thing to mention is that we also try to keep the more experienced teachers in the profession so that there are payouts for periods of time that you have stayed in the profession. So typically, for example, by the time a teacher reaches 40 or 50 years, they would receive quite a handsome payout for staying in the profession. There's a reason for that, because our average age of teaching is very low, about 33, and we want to have more experienced teachers in the profession. Salaries for teachers have been constantly revised, the most recent being 2012. We also introduced the GROW package, and part of it I've already talked about. For example, the payouts and everything. GROW stands for growth, recognition, opportunities, well-being, because we believe that this would help them to stay in the profession. In terms of teacher evaluation and student learning outcomes, I need to say this upfront, that teachers are not evaluated based on students' test scores at all. Truly. So that's something that we need to bear in mind. It is really not about students' test scores. In fact, if you look at my whole presentation, the emphasis is on developing the child holistically and building the right values. So, in short, what are some of the takeaways and reflections on the Singapore story? Number one, selecting and attracting top quality educators is a key cornerstone of our education system. Secondly, competitive compensation and career development packages. Thirdly, professionalism of the teaching profession, and that is when we moved the teacher training college into the university from 1991 onwards. Fourthly, it is about careful, planned school leadership development. Fifthly, it is about systemic coherence. We believed in an enhanced tripartite model, which has very close partnership between the National Institute of Education that prepares all teachers for schools, the Ministry of Education, and all 360 schools out there. We have no problems with clinical placements because all 360 schools are open for our students to have their clinical practice every year. And finally, we believe in constantly learning from other systems around the world. So my own summary and reflection on the Singapore system is its judicious policy making that is evidence-informed, and more importantly, it is about fidelity in implementation through systemic coherence. So we are very serious about policy implementation and not just initiatives. In the first part of the presentation, I was very deliberate in showing you all the educational initiatives that have come into the system. But it is really not about talk. We truly try to walk the talk as well. And I think that is a key feature of our so-called success story. But what is not reflected here is that we are very conscious of not resting on our laurels. We are constantly thinking ahead of what we need to improve as we look and scan the local as well as the global educational landscape. Finally, I'd like to also share about what Singapore can learn from other systems and some of the challenges I feel that we are facing in the road ahead. Firstly, we always ask ourselves, we have a very highly structured system, but how can we unleash true greatness, innovation, and creativity? I was very much struck by this when I was sent to represent Singapore in Seattle for the Global Cities in Education Network, and it struck me that within one city like Seattle, you've got Starbucks, Boeing, and Microsoft. 3 giant multinational companies. How can Singapore unleash potential of that caliber? Secondly, how do we ensure that our students emerge with the right values to cope with an increasingly globalized, complicated, unpredictable 21st century world? Thirdly, how do we continue to level up what we call low progress learners? We have seen the figures improve, but I'm sure we can continue to do better. Fourthly, how do we help our students to achieve a level of English proficiency, English having been the medium of instruction in all schools since 1987, but how can we allow them to acquire a level of proficiency in the English language as equivalent to other English-speaking nations around the world? This is very important. Fifthly, how do we realize the vision that every school is indeed a good school or even a great school? And finally, how do we stay globally relevant and competitive? What would continually be our edge? So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention.